Welcome to today's Acts of the Puppets. We're giving Luke, our storyteller, a rest today because he's still writing today's story. That's because we're covering these 5 whole chapters of Acts and we've got loads of puppets to introduce you to. So recently we've been following the adventures of Paul, haven't we? Do you remember he was originally Saul, who persecuted the church, and then he was knocked off his horse by Jesus and became a great evangelist who we know as Paul. Well, let's begin with Paul this week. Good morning, Paul. How are you doing? All right, you've been busy. And this week we're going to be meeting your friends, aren't we? Priscilla and Aquila. Good morning, Priscilla and Aquila. And another young evangelist called Apollos. There's Apollos. And this week we'll also meet sleepyhead Eutychus. Anyone who was watching the service last week will know what happened to Eutychus. And don't forget to look out for this week's animal. Who is it this week, Toby? Very exciting. Fresh from Scotland, we have a Highland cow who's joined us all the way from our travels. Toby has actually named this little fellow Christmassy. We don't know why. We think perhaps it's his tartan kilt that... No, I nearly said skirt then, didn't it? Tartan kilt that looks a bit Christmassy, doesn't it? Anyway, so this is who you need to look out for this week, folks, okay? Brilliant. Thank you, everybody. We'll begin with Paul. We know that Paul was a great evangelist, famous for spreading the good news of Jesus far and wide, going from town to town to begin new churches. But he didn't do it alone. Priscilla and Aquila were a husband and wife who lived in the city of Corinth. They became great friends with Paul, and while he was there, he lived and worked with them, helping them to make tents. It's good to have friends you can share your life and work with, isn't it? And your faith. So Paul stayed for 1.5 years and he saw more people become followers of Jesus. But eventually it was time to move on. Paul felt God was telling him to return to Jerusalem to see James and Peter and the apostles again, the old gang. So he waved goodbye to Priscilla and Aquila. After Paul had gone, another young man called Apollos came along. He was a new Christian and he wanted to spread the message too, just like Paul. Like Paul, he knew the scriptures really well, though it turned out he didn't know everything about the way of Jesus. So Priscilla and Aquila took him under their wing too and taught him more about Jesus. They taught him what they learned from Paul. And soon Apollos was ready to go out and spread the good news too. And so many more people became followers of Jesus because of him. Well, Priscilla and Aquila wrote to tell Paul all about this. And when Paul read the letter, he was really glad to hear about it. He wasn't jealous of someone else becoming a travelling evangelist just like him. Whether it was Paul or Apollos planting the seed, it was God who made it grow. But you know what? There were more adventures in store for Paul. Wherever he travelled on his way back to Jerusalem, amazing things happened. Sick people became well, evil spirits went, people were made whole and became followers of Jesus. But not everyone was happy when Paul turned up in their city. In fact, one day there was a riot. Demetrius was a silversmith in Ephesus. He and many others made a living by creating silver models of the goddess Artemis, to whom there was a temple in Ephesus. They would sell their mini idols and make lots of money. But since the Christians had been in town, he worried that their talk of Jesus as the true God would damage their business and people wouldn't want to buy little statues of Artemis anymore. So when Paul arrived, he stirred up the people of the town against the Christians. And they shouted, "Great is Artemis of Ephesus! Great is Artemis of Ephesus!" And a huge crowd gathered round and there was a riot. Until eventually the town sheriff appeared. Yeehaw. She told everyone to calm it down. She said these men have done nothing wrong. They haven't robbed anyone or said evil things about our goddess Artemis. If you want to make a charge against them, then take it up in the court. And she told them off. There's no excuse for this uproar. Told them all to go home, which they did. So Paul, relieved, kept travelling towards Jerusalem. One evening, while he was with the believers in a town called Troas, Paul was talking long into the night in an upstairs room. One of the people listening was Eutychus. Eutychus was sitting listening to Paul by an open window, but Eutychus was tired. And as Paul went on and on and on, Eutychus's eyes got heavier and heavier. I'm sure that's never happened to anyone during my sermons. Cough, cough. Finally, Eutychus fell asleep and fell out of the window. Oh no! He landed with a thump and they thought he was dead. But Paul rushed downstairs and he gave Eutychus a hug. And he said, he's still alive. Eutychus came round safe and well. Phew. And he remembered, Eutychus did, never to sit at an open window again. If only they'd had Andrew Gibb doing their risk assessments, it would never have happened, would it? Anyway, Paul travelled on by land and sea. And before he arrived in Jerusalem, he stopped off to stay with some more friends and believers in Caesarea. But while he was there, one of the believers, who was a prophet called Agabus, came to him. Agabus took Paul's belt and bound his own hands and feet with it. And he said, Paul, I've got bad news. This is how you will be bound and imprisoned by your enemies when you get to Jerusalem, and you'll be handed over to the Romans. Paul's friends were alarmed when they heard what was in store, and they begged him in tears not to go to Jerusalem because it wasn't safe. But Paul replied, what are you doing, weeping and breaking my heart? For I'm ready not only to be bound, but even to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus. And so his friends prayed with him. And then they waved him off. And Paul travelled on and eventually arrived in Jerusalem. And we'll find out in next week's Puppets that Agabus was right. He does get put in prison again. But even though he knew he was probably walking into trouble again, he knew he was being called by God wherever he went. And whether he was free or in prison, on land or sea, he was glad that he had so many friends wherever he went to care for him, to pray for him, to work alongside him, to share the good news of Jesus. So join us next week to find out what happens to Paul in Jerusalem. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Brilliant. Well done.